Darnell Dockett. A defensive tackle for the Arizona Cardinals throughout the 2000s and into the 2010s, Dockett brought relentless interior pressure and a fiery personality that made him a fan favorite locally. Even as national recognition stayed limited, his ability to disrupt plays from the inside helped anchor a defense that carried the franchise to its first Super Bowl appearance. Because that Cardinals team is remembered mostly for its high-powered passing attack, defensive contributors like Dockett often get left out of the broader story. Longtime fans still regard him as one of the most productive and colorful players in franchise history. Jessie Tuggle. A linebacker for the Atlanta Falcons, who went undrafted before becoming one of the most consistent tacklers in franchise history, Tuggle built his career on preparation rather than elite measurables. His instincts allowed him to stay around the football play after play, even without the size or speed teams typically prioritize. Because Atlanta wasn't a competitive franchise for much of his career, his steady excellence rarely reached wider audiences. Falcons fans still point to him as one of the great undrafted success stories in franchise history. Marshal Yanda. An offensive guard for the Baltimore Ravens, Yanda was widely regarded by opposing defensive linemen as one of the toughest interior matchups in the league during his prime. His technical consistency across more than a decade rarely translated into recognition beyond Baltimore itself. Offensive linemen on physical, run-heavy teams often receive less attention than those protecting pass-heavy offenses. Ravens fans continue to view him as one of the most underrated players the franchise has fielded. Darryl Talley. A linebacker for the Buffalo Bills, throughout their run of 4 consecutive Super Bowl appearances, Talley provided steady, physical play at every level of the defense. His versatility let him drop into coverage or attack downhill with equal effectiveness, often while playing alongside more decorated teammates. Because that Bills defense featured several future Hall of Famers, individual credit for a player like Talley frequently got absorbed into the larger unit. Longtime Bills fans still regard him as one of the most complete and overlooked linebackers of that era. Shaq Thompson. A linebacker for the Carolina Panthers, for nearly a decade, Thompson brought steady, versatile play at all 3 levels of the defense, without ever becoming a widely recognized name outside the Carolinas. His ability to drop into coverage as effectively as he filled run gaps gave Carolina's defense a flexibility that opposing offenses had to account for on every snap. Because the Panthers cycled through inconsistent seasons during much of his tenure, his individual reliability rarely reached national conversations. Longtime Panthers fans still regard him as one of the most dependable and underappreciated defenders the franchise has had in the modern era. Lance Briggs. Chicago Bears linebacker. Across 12 seasons, Briggs consistently ranked among the league's top tacklers, while playing alongside a more decorated frontman in Brian Urlacher. His coverage instincts and sideline-to-sideline range made him one of the more complete linebackers of his era, even as most of the attention stayed on his more famous teammate. Because Chicago's defense was often discussed as a unit built around one central star, individual credit for players like Briggs frequently got overlooked. Bears fans still regard him as one of the most consistently excellent and most underrated defenders the franchise has had in the modern era. Domata Peko. Playing nose tackle for the Cincinnati Bengals, Peko provided steady interior run defense across more than a decade, work that rarely generates individual attention. His ability to occupy blockers freed up linebackers around him to make plays. Interior linemen in general remain among the most undervalued positions in football coverage. Peko's consistency stands as a quiet but significant part of Bengals' defensive history during his tenure. Pruitt. A running back and return specialist for the Cleveland Browns during the 1970s, Pruitt brought a rare combination of speed and versatility to an offense built mostly around physical, straightforward running. He introduced stylistic touches, including tearaway jerseys, that eventually influenced league uniform rules. Despite his impact, Cleveland's inconsistent team success during that stretch limited how far his recognition traveled. Browns fans from that era still point to him as one of the most dynamic playmakers the franchise has had. Darren Woodson. Playing safety for the Dallas Cowboys during their 1990s championship run, Woodson provided physical, versatile defense that rarely matched the attention given to the team's offensive stars. His ability to defend both the run and the pass made him one of the most complete safeties of his generation. Because Dallas's roster featured so many high-profile names, his individual contributions often went under-discussed. Woodson remains one of the more debated Hall of Fame snubs among players from that dynasty. Rod Smith. Playing wide receiver for the Denver Broncos, Smith went undrafted before becoming one of the most productive pass catchers in franchise history. His route running and toughness made him a favorite target during 2 championship seasons. Lacking the typical college pedigree that builds early recognition, his overall standing often lagged behind his actual production. Broncos fans still regard him as one of the most complete receivers the franchise has ever had. Dominic Raiola. A center for the Detroit Lions, across nearly his entire career in the 2000s and into the 2010s, Raiola anchored an offensive line through some of the most difficult seasons in franchise history, including the winless 2008 campaign. His toughness and leadership in the trenches rarely translated into outside recognition, since interior linemen on struggling teams almost never draw attention. Because Detroit wasn't competitive for long stretches during his tenure, his individual consistency stayed largely overlooked outside the fan base. Lions fans still regard him as one of the most durable and underappreciated players to wear the uniform during that difficult era. Sterling Sharpe. Playing wide receiver for the Green Bay Packers, Sharpe was among the most productive pass catchers in the league before a neck injury cut his career short. His route running and toughness made him a reliable target even before the franchise's championship years began. Because his career ended just before Green Bay's Super Bowl run, his contributions sometimes get left out of the team's most celebrated history. Packers fans from that era still regard him as one of the most talented receivers to ever wear the uniform. DeMeco Ryans. A linebacker for the Houston Texans, during the franchise's early years, Ryans quickly became one of the most productive tacklers in the league. Despite playing for a team still finding its footing, his instincts and leadership stood out even as Houston struggled to reach the playoffs during his prime seasons. Because the Texans weren't yet a nationally relevant franchise, his individual excellence rarely reached wider audiences. His later success as a head coach has brought renewed appreciation for how disciplined his playing career actually was. Bob Sanders. Sanders played with a physicality and instinctive aggression that made him one of the most feared defenders in the league whenever he was healthy. His impact was significant enough to earn Defensive Player of the Year honors during a season where his presence visibly transformed Indianapolis's entire defense. Constant injuries limited him to only a handful of full seasons, which kept his overall career totals modest. Despite his obvious peak-level dominance, Colts fans still regard him as one of the most explosive, if unfortunately short-lived, defensive talents the franchise has had. Jimmy Smith. A wide receiver for the Jacksonville Jaguars, Smith developed a strong statistical resume during a period when Jacksonville wasn't a major national storyline. His route running and reliability made him a favorite target for over a decade. Because his prime overlapped with several more marketed receivers around the league, broader recognition remained limited. Jaguars fans still consider him one of the most productive offensive players in franchise history. Will Shields. An offensive guard for the Kansas City Chiefs across 12 seasons, Shields started every single game of his career without missing a snap to injury, a remarkable feat of durability that rarely gets discussed outside offensive line circles. His technical footwork and consistency made him one of the most respected interior linemen among his peers, even as broader recognition remained limited during his playing days. Guards almost never receive the credit that skill position players do, no matter how dominant they are on tape. Chiefs fans still regard him as one of the most reliable and quietly excellent players in franchise history. Cliff Branch. Playing wide receiver for the Oakland Raiders across 3 Super Bowl championships, Branch combined blazing speed with reliable hands in a way that made him one of the most feared deep threats of his era. Despite that sustained postseason success, he has remained one of the more debated Hall of Fame omissions for decades. His route running against tight man coverage set a standard that influenced deep threats who came after him. Raiders fans still consider his exclusion from Canton one of the sport's more puzzling snubs. Stan Humphries. Humphries led the franchise to its only Super Bowl appearance, yet his overall career often gets discussed briefly compared to more decorated quarterbacks of his era. His toughness and ability to manage difficult game situations made him a trusted leader in the huddle. Because that Chargers team ultimately fell short in the championship game, his individual contributions faded quickly from broader conversations. Longtime Chargers fans still credit him as central to that franchise's most successful stretch. Isaac Bruce. Playing wide receiver for the then St. Louis Rams, Bruce was a key piece of one of the most explosive offenses in league history, often working alongside more highlighted teammates on that roster. His route running and deep threat ability made him a consistent statistical leader throughout his career, even during seasons when the passing attack featured multiple standout weapons. Because that offense produced so many individually celebrated players, recognition for Bruce's own excellence sometimes got spread thin. His reception totals still rank among the best in league history, despite limited broader acknowledgement outside dedicated Rams circles. Mark Clayton. Playing wide receiver for the Miami Dolphins alongside a fast-paced passing offense, Clayton formed one half of a dangerous receiving duo that rarely gets discussed in broader historical conversations. His speed and precise route running made him a consistent deep threat throughout the 1980s. Miami's inability to close out championship runs during that period limited how much national attention followed the offense's individual stars. Dolphins fans from that era still consider him one of the most explosive receivers the franchise has produced. Chad Greenway. A linebacker for the Minnesota Vikings, across more than a decade, Greenway provided steady, reliable tackling and leadership through multiple coaching changes and roster overhauls. His consistency rarely generated highlight reel attention, since his value came from discipline and positioning rather than flashy plays. Minnesota's inconsistent playoff success during parts of his tenure limited how far his reputation spread nationally. Vikings fans still regard him as one of the most dependable defensive anchors of that era. Teddy Bruschi. Bruschi anchored the middle of the defense through 3 championship runs, often working in the shadow of more publicized teammates. His instincts and preparation let him consistently read plays before they developed, a skill that rarely shows up in traditional stat lines. After suffering a stroke midway through his career, he returned to play at a high level, a comeback that remains one of the more remarkable and under-discussed stories in franchise history. Patriots fans still regard him as one of the most essential, if quietly overlooked, defensive leaders of that dynasty. Deuce McAllister. McAllister became the franchise's all-time leading rusher during a period when the team wasn't yet a consistent playoff contender. His combination of power and burst made him one of the more complete backs of his era, even as injuries limited his later seasons. Because New Orleans hadn't yet built the national following it would gain in later years, his individual production stayed largely regional. Saints fans still regard him as one of the most important offensive players in franchise history. Justin Tuck. Tuck became a key pass rusher during 2 Super Bowl championship runs, often overshadowed by bigger personalities on those rosters. His ability to disrupt plays from multiple positions along the line gave the Giants valuable versatility during the postseason. Because those Giants teams featured several other standout defensive players, his individual contributions sometimes went under-discussed. Giants fans still credit him as one of the most important pieces of those championship defenses. Marty Lyons. A defensive lineman for the New York Jets throughout the 1980s, Lyons anchored a front 7 that helped define the franchise's identity during that decade. His steady, physical play rarely generated the same attention as more statistically flashy pass rushers around the league. Because the Jets weren't consistent championship contenders during his tenure, his contributions stayed largely regional. Longtime Jets fans still regard him as one of the most dependable defenders in franchise history. Dallas Goedert. Out of FCS South Dakota State, Goedert has quietly produced some of the most efficient receiving numbers at his position, while often sharing the spotlight with higher-profile skill players on that roster. His blocking ability adds a dimension that many pass-catching tight ends don't offer, making him valuable in ways that don't always show up in box scores. Because Philadelphia's offense has featured several other prominent weapons during his tenure, his individual contributions often get mentioned only in passing. Eagles fans still regard him as one of the most complete and underappreciated tight ends in the league. Aaron Smith. Aaron Smith played a disciplined, run-stopping role for the Steelers' defense. His ability to control gaps and hold his ground against double teams allowed linebackers behind him to make plays with much more freedom. Because his value came from positioning and technique rather than sack totals, his contributions often went unnoticed by casual observers. Steelers fans and coaches from that era consistently point to him as one of the most essential, if underrated, pieces of those championship-caliber defenses. Bryant Young. Young provided steady interior pressure and run defense during a period when the franchise's offense drew most of the national attention. His return from a severe leg injury to continued elite play remains one of the most under-discussed comeback stories in league history. Interior linemen in general receive limited recognition, and Young's career reflects that pattern clearly. 49ers fans still regard him as one of the most resilient and dependable defenders the team has had. K.J. Wright. A linebacker for the Seattle Seahawks, throughout the Pete Carroll era, Wright played a crucial role in the Legion of Boom defense, while often standing in the shadow of more decorated teammates like Bobby Wagner and Richard Sherman. His length and coverage instincts made him uniquely suited to handle tight ends and slot receivers, a matchup role that rarely shows up in traditional stat lines. Because that Seattle defense featured so many all-pro caliber players, individual recognition for Wright frequently got absorbed into the larger group's reputation. Seahawks fans still regard him as one of the most versatile and underappreciated pieces of that championship-era defense. Rondé Barber. Barber built one of the most well-rounded careers among defensive backs, combining coverage skill with a rare knack for interceptions and sacks. His longevity and versatility made him a defensive centerpiece well beyond the franchise's championship season. Because he shared a roster with other higher-profile defensive stars, individual recognition for Barber often lagged behind his actual production. Buccaneers fans still regard him as one of the most complete players in franchise history. Blaine Bishop. A safety for the Tennessee Titans during their Super Bowl run, Bishop provided physical, reliable coverage that rarely showed up in national headlines. His tackling and communication helped stabilize a defense that carried the team through a deep playoff push. Because Tennessee's offense drew most of the attention during that era, defensive contributors like Bishop stayed largely under the radar. Titans fans from that period still remember his steady presence in the secondary. Ryan Kerrigan. Kerrigan consistently produced double-digit sack totals while playing for a team that rarely reached deep into the playoffs during his tenure. His relentless motor and disciplined technique made him one of the more complete edge defenders of his era, even without the flashy reputation some of his contemporaries built. Because the team around him struggled to find sustained success, his individual production stayed largely under the radar on a national scale. Longtime fans of the franchise still regard him as one of the most durable and underappreciated pass rushers the team has had in the modern era.